Hello, and welcome back to Canna Intel 420, where we strip away the noise and dig into the data behind how cannabis actually became what it is today. Before we dive in, a quick note for compliance and clarity. This content is for educational and historical purposes only. It doesn't promote or encourage the use, sale, or cultivation of cannabis where it's illegal, and it's not medical advice. Always follow your local, state, and tribal regulations. And if you're using cannabis for health reasons, talk with a licensed healthcare professional first. With that said, this episode isn't about selling you anything. It's about understanding how we got here, how myths became marketing, how marketing became culture, and how culture became the reason science is still playing catch-up. If you've been following this series, you already know what we do here. We take the stories the industry keeps repeating, hold them up against science, and trace how culture, law, and human hands built the myths that still shape dispensary menus right now. So, settle in and let's start. Before cannabis ever became an industry, it was already a global ecosystem. Each region cultivated genetics shaped by its own climate, soil, and cultural use. Afghanistan's high-altitude valleys produced short, broad-leaf plants designed to endure harsh temperature swings and short seasons. Southeast Asia's tropical forests produced tall, narrow-leaf cultivars adapted to long, consistent light cycles. South American and African landraces developed in humid equatorial conditions with looser flower structure to prevent mold. These regional differences weren't about indica or sativa. They were about environmental survival, natural selection shaped by place. The problem began when those plants were forced to coexist outside their native ecologies. In the 1960s and 1970s, global migration, tourism, and smuggling converged. Seeds from Thailand, Panama, Colombia, and Afghanistan started circulating through the US and Europe. They didn't arrive in labs or universities. They arrived in people's pockets, film canisters, and guitar cases. For the first time in human history, cannabis from every region of the world was growing side by side in clandestine conditions. Then came the second variable, prohibition. When the U.S. declared the war on drugs, cannabis went from a counterculture symbol to a high-risk agricultural target. Outdoor fields were raided, helicopters were deployed, and enforcement became militarized. Growers adapted by moving indoors, basements, attics, warehouses, and barns retrofitted with crude lighting setups. This single environmental shift changed cannabis evolution more than any genetic event in centuries. Artificial light, heat buildup, and limited vertical space punished the tall, slow-flowering tropical cultivars. The new environment demanded compact plants that finished fast. That's where Afghanica genetics became critical. Plants from the Hindu Kush region naturally produced dense resin heads, shorter stature, and a 45 to 60-day flowering window, perfect for the constraints of indoor growing. Those traits gave Western growers a survival toolkit: faster turnover, denser flowers, and less risk of detection. Within a few growing cycles, Afghan stock became the genetic backbone of nearly every underground breeding project. These crosses weren't planned for chemical diversity or scientific inquiry. They were survival breeding programs run by people under constant threat of arrest. The results were hybrids that no longer fit into traditional classification. Growers were mixing short-season Afghans with long-season tropical plants, creating offspring that didn't behave predictably. Some hybrids expressed narrow leaves but finished quickly. Others stayed short, but produced cerebral highs. The chemical and morphological rules of the old land races didn't apply anymore. Growers needed a way to describe what they were seeing, but they didn't have laboratories, chemical assays, or even reliable testing equipment. They had language. And that's how the first crude binary emerged. Indica became shorthand for the new indoor phenotype: compact, resin-heavy, sedating. Sativa was shorthand for the opposite: tall, airy, and energetic. Neither term described genetic lineage. Both described function under artificial pressure. These weren't scientific categories. They were field notes. Indica meant something that wouldn't blow up your ceiling or take 4 months to finish. Sativa meant something that stretched, produced less resin, but carried a different type of high. The irony is that prohibition didn't just change how cannabis was grown, it rewrote what the plant even was. By selecting for short flowering cycles and resin output, growers unintentionally erased most of the natural diversity that had taken millennia to form. Long flowering equatorial lines from Thailand, Panama, and Africa were largely lost from circulation because they were impractical to hide and expensive to maintain. In other words, the illegal market became the world's largest selective breeding experiment, and the traits it favored were defined not by biology, but by fear. As those hybrids spread, so did the shorthand. Photocopied newsletters and word-of-mouth systems became the early data networks of cannabis. People used I and S next to strain names as a survival language. It wasn't about chemistry, it was about trade. You could buy or swap genetics faster if people thought they knew what the plant would do. A one-letter label could move a bag of seeds across the country without a grower having to describe effects or growth cycles. The binary worked because it compressed chaos into something everyone could repeat. By the early 1980s, the U.S. was exporting underground genetics to Europe, and Europe was exporting vocabulary back. When Amsterdam began forming the first a dye-tolerant market, they didn't create the binary, they inherited it. But they did something the underground never could. They monetized it. Coffee shops needed menu categories, and seed banks needed catalog order. The words Indica and Sativa became more than code. They became marketing architecture. The tragedy behind it is simple. The cannabis binary was not built by science. It was built by survival. Every environmental factor, light cycle, enforcement risk, limited space, shaped both the genetics and the vocabulary. The world didn't divide cannabis into two species. Prohibition did. And the labels that began as shorthand for plant behavior under stress eventually became the language of global commerce, medicine, and culture. The first serious break with folk labeling didn't come from breeders or magazines. It came from pharmacology. In the late 80s and early 90s, researchers mapped the primary brain receptor that THC binds to, CB1, identified a second receptor, mostly outside the CNS, CB2, and then isolated the body's own ligands, anandamide, then 2AG. That work reframed cannabis from two plant types to a receptor-driven system. Effect isn't dictated by leaf shape, it's the sum of what molecules hit, which receptors, where, and for how long. Once the receptor picture existed, labs had to measure what the plant was actually delivering. Early analytics relied on gas chromatography, GC, coupled to mass spectrometry for volatile analysis, a method that cleanly separates terpenes. GC made one thing obvious fast. Samples with nearly identical THC could smell and feel very different because their terpene bouquets were different. At the same time, GC is brutal on cannabinoids. Heat converts the acidic forms, THCA, CBDA, to their neutral forms, THC, CBD, which muddies potency if you're trying to understand the plant as consumed versus as raw biomass. So, labs moved to high-performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, with UV detection for cannabinoids. HPLC separates acids and neutrals without forcing decarb, which finally lets people see whether a flower is mostly THCA, a balanced THC, CBD acid mix, or CBD heavy with trace THC. That's where the Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 classification came from. Not mythology, but consistent chromatograms. None of that required or supported slotting samples into two legacy buckets. As methods stabilized, a pattern emerged that marketing never captured. Neutral THC levels mostly predict intensity, not character. Character, the part people call clear, stony, focused, sleepy, tracks with aromatic composition. GCMS kept surfacing the same families, lots of myrcene correlating with heavier, body-weighted reports, limonene often aligning with brighter mood, terpinolene showing up in cultivars people describe as mentally airy or wide angle, pinene trending with focus and memory retention. None of that maps cleanly to a plant's silhouette or where its grandparents grew. It maps to the volatile chemistry in the jar that day. Two more facts undercut the folk labels. First, post-harvest handling changes what the plant says. Drying temperature, water activity, storage oxygen, and time all move terpene ratios. The same cut can feel different if it was dried too hot or parked for 6 weeks in a warm back room. Second, environment shifts the output. Light spectrum, HPS versus MH versus early LED, root zone EC, VPD control, and harvest maturity all alter secondary metabolite production. In other words, even if names were stable, they aren't. The chemistry still drifts with grow and cure decisions. That's a production reality, not a debate. Genetics entered the lab, too. Before whole genome work was cheap, population studies using markers showed what growers suspected. Most market cultivars are tangled mosaics. Lines sold under opposite folk labels often sat in the same genetic neighborhoods. Later sequencing only made that clearer. There isn't a clean split that predicts effect. Morphology can be practical for cultivation decisions, but it doesn't forecast pharmacology. By the early 2000s, the pieces were on the table. Receptors explain how molecules land. HPLC tells you how much of which cannabinoids are present in their actual forms. GCMS shows which volatiles steer sensory tone. Environmental and handling variables explain why the same name can feel different across batches. None of that needs the old tags. It needs accurate panels and honest reporting. This is the pivot the public never got. Naming conventions promised certainty. The lab methods replaced that with measurement. From here, the only classification that holds up is based on what's quantified: cannabinoid profile for strength, terpene composition for character, and production data for batch-to-batch reliability. That's the start of real literacy. By the early 2000s, analytical clarity existed, but the consumer market had not caught up. Laboratories could separate THCA from THC, map terpene fingerprints, and display chemical variants across cultivars. Yet, dispensary menus still reflected a myth built on appearance and hearsay. The gap between measurement and meaning widened with legalization. Testing became mandatory in many jurisdictions, but the data often remained orphaned from education. Cannabinoid and terpene panels were printed on labels, but few could interpret them beyond total THC. The new task wasn't discovery, it was translation. Chemotype literacy required linking measurable profiles to predictable patterns in sensory and physiological response. Studies comparing consumer reports with lab results consistently showed that overall effect correlates with multi-compound composition, not with single cannabinoids. For instance, balanced ratios of limonene, beta-caryophyllene, and linalool often aligned with relaxed yet clear mood states, while high concentrations of myrcene and humulene trended toward sedative or body-weighted outcomes. These weren't speculative associations. They appeared repeatedly in data sets compiled across thousands of samples from California, Colorado, and Canada. Despite that, retail environments reduced the conversation back to a single axis: THC percentage. The regulatory obsession with potency created economic distortion. Breeders selected for higher THC because it commanded price premiums, while terpenic complexity, the factor most responsible for experiential nuance, became collateral damage. This selective pressure mirrored what Prohibition once did. It narrowed diversity under external demand. The difference was that now the constraint wasn't law enforcement, it was market psychology. Chemotype education tries to reverse that compression. Instead of dividing products by invented families, a functional system classifies by dominant chemical families. A limonene-dominant chemotype behaves differently from a myrcene-dominant one, regardless of morphology. When paired with accurate cannabinoid data, this framework produces predictable consumer outcomes without invoking mythology. For example, a type 2 cultivar with near equal THCA and CBDA but high terpinolene will generate a markedly different cognitive response than a type 1 with equivalent THC but dominated by myrcene and linalool. That distinction has measurable grounding and repeatable behavior. The educational challenge is accessibility. Most consumers and even many bud tenders lack the baseline chemistry vocabulary to connect profiles to experience. Effective programs start by reframing the panel itself. Cannabinoids define amplitude, terpenes shape contour, cultivation and curing define texture. From there, each product can be described using measurable cause and effect language: high limonene, medium pinene, trace myrcene. Expect bright onset and short duration, instead of inherited binaries. The outcome is not only accuracy, but liability protection. When education is rooted in verified data, claims become defensible under consumer protection and advertising law. Laboratories have begun standardizing reporting templates to aid this transition. Multi-analyte dashboards convert microgram per gram values into percentile maps, displaying dominant compounds visually. This data infrastructure allows producers to maintain chemotype consistency across harvests by adjusting environmental parameters, light spectrum, nutrient balance, harvest timing to stabilize target ratios. That's the real future of branding: consistency through quantifiable reproducibility, not storytelling. Yet adoption remains uneven. Many regulators require testing, but not interpretation, leaving dispensaries to bridge science and sales on their own. The next phase of cannabis literacy depends on merging compliance infrastructure with consumer education. Every certificate of analysis is a teaching document waiting to be read aloud, proof that cannabis identity can finally move from myth to measurement. As legalization spread through the 2010s, laboratories and cultivators found themselves operating under two competing realities: the precision of chemistry and the inertia of marketing. Governments demanded quantifiable safety data, pesticide thresholds, microbial counts, potency verification, while the public demanded familiarity. The result was a fractured compliance environment where data existed but meaning was optional. Regulators wrote laws for numbers, not narratives. They required total THC on labels, but not context for how that number came to exist, nor what it represented pharmacologically. The category problem, born in basements, refined in Amsterdam, and dismantled in labs, remained embedded in bureaucracy. In nearly every jurisdiction, potency reporting became the proxy for quality. A certificate of analysis had to list cannabinoids to 2 decimal points, yet terpene data remained voluntary, unstandardized, or entirely absent. This imbalance shaped retail psychology. Dispensaries began competing on percentage alone, conditioning consumers to equate stronger with better. Laboratories, pressured by client expectations, often calibrated toward inflationary readings, a pattern documented in audit reviews from California, Oregon, and Nevada. The economic bias created a feedback loop identical in structure to the old Indica Sativa divide: a simplistic signal standing in for complex chemistry because it was easy to sell and even easier to print on a label. True regulatory literacy begins where marketing ends. In mature agricultural industries, compliance frameworks are built around traceability systems, the ability to verify how and where a product was produced. Cannabis remains inconsistent here. MeatRC and BioTrack provide movement tracking, but not quality context. Without chemical metadata linked directly to cultivation conditions, regulators can't evaluate the stability of a cultivar or its claimed effects. That gap is not technological, it's linguistic. Agencies designed data fields for quantity and location, not expression. A plant is logged as a unit, not a chemical profile. Consequently, 2 products bearing the same name can occupy different chemical realities while remaining legally indistinguishable. A true chemotype-based compliance structure would invert this logic. Instead of labeling by strain name or folk family, each product would declare its dominant compound ratios within an accepted tolerance band. A producer selling a limonene-dominant type 1 cultivar would have to demonstrate batch consistency across multiple harvests within, say, 10% terpene variance and 5% cannabinoid variance. That level of reproducibility already exists in food and perfume manufacturing. It's simply absent from cannabis because the language of compliance hasn't caught up to the science. Education can fill that gap faster than regulation. When bud tenders explain products through quantifiable composition rather than personality branding, they not only improve consumer outcomes, but also protect operators from false advertising claims. Legal exposure decreases when descriptors are anchored in analytical data rather than assumed effects. Contains 1.8% myrcene and 0.7% limonene is a statement of fact. Produces deep relaxation is a claim subject to challenge. The future of compliant retail communication will depend on this linguistic discipline, precise enough to inform, neutral enough to pass scrutiny, and transparent enough to rebuild trust in an industry that spent decades speaking mythologically. The United States and Canada have started inching toward this model. Some provinces now permit effect-based categorization only when supported by verified chemical data. In Minnesota, early draft frameworks for adult use labeling mirror the nutritional panel logic of food products: standardized formatting, mandatory primary cannabinoid disclosure, and optional terpene profiles. It's the first sign of language reform written into law, a step toward an evidence-based lexicon. When chemistry defines communication, the market stabilizes around truth instead of novelty. The metrics exist, the instruments exist, and the data already sit inside regulatory servers. What's missing is translation, turning chemical literacy into consumer language without sacrificing precision. Once that happens, cannabis won't need mythology to sell itself. It will have transparency, reproducibility, and the one thing no prohibition ever allowed it: scientific integrity. Yet myths also evolve. Across the industry, educators, breeders, and researchers are working to replace the binary with a language grounded in measurable chemistry. Dispensaries are beginning to abandon the old categories, organizing menus around effect-based language: calming, creative, focus-driven, sleep-supportive. These descriptors are backed by laboratory data, terpene profiles, and cannabinoid ratios, rather than leaf shape or breeder lore. At the same time, researchers are developing predictive models that can map consumer experience through chemical fingerprints instead of outdated lineage claims. Slowly, the conversation is shifting from myth to mechanism. This evolution is part of a longer arc, the journey from landrace to hybrid, from shorthand to myth, and from myth to science. Nepalese charas, Congolese reds, Panamanian golds, Afghanica resins, each carried its own truth of place and adaptation. But it was human crossing, naming, and storytelling that wove those truths into a shared lexicon. The Indica-Sativa divide was never a taxonomic reality. It was a cultural artifact, a fossil of the hybrid explosion still embedded in our language. To move beyond it is not to erase history, but to honor it more fully. Recognizing that cannabis cannot be contained by two boxes means finally seeing it as it is: a plant of extraordinary plasticity shaped by environment, chemistry, and human imagination. The myth was born of necessity, a way to make sense of complexity during Prohibition. But its dismantling can be born of education and respect, a willingness to give the plant back its depth, its nuance, and its truth. That is the challenge and the opportunity for this generation of growers, educators, and consumers to replace myth with knowledge while carrying forward the reverence that gave rise to those myths in the first place. This content is for educational and historical purposes only. It is not medical advice and does not promote or encourage unlawful cultivation or consumption of cannabis. Always comply with local, state, and tribal regulations. If you followed this series, you know what we're here to do: to trace where the myths came from, to show how they shaped the present, and to rebuild the language of cannabis on the foundation of truth. If this helped shift how you see the plant, hit like, subscribe, and share it forward. Every bit of support helps keep this work alive, telling cannabis stories the way they deserve to be told.